So welcome once again to our online discussion, and it is the second discussion in our series about World War II and how there are challenges of commemoration and everyday remembrance in the world about World War II. And first of all, we started with the discussion on September 2nd. It was about Poland, Germany, and Russia. And now we are going to East Asia, and especially in particular to Korea and Japan, and not only. My name is Kristina Smolyaninovaite, and I'm a deputy director at the Secretariat of the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum. I'm also managing the program of the Forum on Historical Memory and Education. Today, this discussion is done in partnership with our colleagues, friends, and also forum member, the Jan Nowak Jezoransky College of Eastern Europe in Wrocław, and also the New Eastern Journal, which is the news magazine dedicated to Central and Eastern Europe affairs published by the college. So in EU-Russia Civil Society Forum was established in 2011, and next year we will celebrate our 10th anniversary starting from the 29th of March with events which would be stretching out in the whole year. And the forum is a platform of, at the moment, 184 non-governmental organizations from Russia and the European Union, which are members or supporters of the forum. So historical memory, it was quite important topic, or conflicting memories. It was quite important topic for the forum from its beginning. And in 2013, the working group was established, which is called Historical Memory and Education. Gradually, the work on World War II was put forward in our debate and projects. In 2015, the working group created an exhibition which is called Different Wars. It is about history school textbooks and how World War II is depicted in history textbooks in 6 countries: in Italy, Poland, Czech Republic, Germany, Russia, and Lithuania. It traveled to 22 cities in the EU and Russia, as well as Belarus. And it was quite a successful project, and especially it was socially important project because it brought deep conversation, some deep thoughts to the public level. In May, we also made a short film, Clash of Memories, on World War II in Poland, Germany, and Russia to commemorate 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Here I would like also to thank once again Stefano Di Pietro, who was director of this film, and Christina Rick, who was supporting and helped with the creation of this film. And in the last 4 days, we had a winter school with history teachers from Belarus, Germany, Poland, and Russia, who are designing lessons on World War II using a multi-perspectivity approach. So why East Asia now? So I received this question quite a few times, and also when I first time talked with our moderator today of this discussion, he also asked me why East Asia, because it seems that EU and Russia is also far away from the geography of our forum, like this EU and East Asia. So for us, World War II touches everyone. Even though it is difficult to say it was one World War II. It was many wars in one big war, different fights, different enemies. It was different wars, as we also called our project. And this can be also observed today. I will not go into details about conflicting memories, so that's why we have our panelists today and moderator who will tackle more about conflicting memories in their countries, in the region. Just wanted to add that, finally, that there is no black and white, but we can try to find the shades of gray in our history education, and that's what we put our efforts to find points that unites us. So I wish you a fruitful discussion today, and I also encourage the audience ask questions to our panelists today. And on this note, I would like to give a floor to the moderator of this discussion today, Professor Daging Yang from George Washington University, and present the panelists. So the floor is yours, Professor Yang.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, welcome to everybody. You picked a very good day for your previous discussion on September 2nd, because that is the day when the Empire of Japan signed the Instrument of Surrender, so officially ending the World War II. Now, I understand this date may not be familiar to everyone in Europe, but that speaks to different ways the same war has been remembered in different countries. Now, it's a different war also in reality, but there were important connections with the European countries. Difference in terms of the fact that much of East Asia and Southeast Asia were colonies of Japan, of Britain, of other European powers, but there were very important connections. For example, then Soviet Union was an early supporter of China in its war against Japan, and also Soviet Union entered the war against Japan in the final stages of war. Of course, Britain, Netherlands, because of their colonies, were deeply involved in that conflict. But here we're discussing the memories of the war because it has been 75 years. And in many ways, as you will hear, different countries in the region had developed different remembrance of the war. But at the same time, especially in recent decades, we also have influences from the global memory culture that also shape the memories of war in different regions. So as Christina mentioned, my name is Dacheng Yang. I teach Japanese history and international affairs at the George Washington University. I also co-direct a program called Memory and Reconciliation in Asia Pacific. You can find the website memoryreconciliation.org. I'm very honored to moderate this excellent panel. So I will start by asking each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and tell us how their work is related to the memories of World War II in your professional life, and what do you think is the most important aspect to remember in this episode. May I maybe start with Seiko in Japan? Could you unmute yourself?
Hello, everyone. So thank you for inviting me to this fantastic panel. And I'm very happy to have conversation on memory and history at such diverse and multilateral forum. So yes, so now, so Japan, so about history problem, actually, so the situation is not so bright, so not so good. So the many things happened, and I think the one thing is so for example, the now historical revisionism comes from the very center, political center. For example, the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, so he has just resigned, but so he criticized the so-called masochistic historical view, focusing too much dark side of modern Japan history. So this kind of view is widely shared in Japan. So, and also, so from 1990s, so in East Asia, Japan, China, South Korea, the scholars, so including Professor Dachin, so we accumulated a lot of historical dialogue among scholars and intellectuals. But now, so we are witnessing the like more populistic version of historical view, and actually the scholars' work is not always appreciated in Japan. So maybe we have to talk about this kind of like populism about history problem and how intellectuals, we scholars can cope with and how we can face these challenges. And also, so Professor Dachin mentioned global memory culture. I think it is very important view to understand the East Asian history problem. So, for example, the one most biggest history problem between Japan and South Korea is comfort women issue. And in Japan, so this comfort women issue is recognized as just diplomatic like political issue. But I think this is human rights issue, and not only in Japan, South Korea, not only government, but citizens, and so the people in the world. So this should be recognized as a universal human rights issue. But this perspective is quite lacking here. So I think it's nice to have a conversation on comfort women from this global perspective and how we can like treat this problem in more universal way and of course more reconciliatory way. So I forget, sorry, so my introduction of myself. So my name is Seiko Mimaki from Takasaki City University of Economics. And I worked on mainly the relation between Japan and the United States. And of course, atomic bombing is one of the thorny historical issue. But compared with the relation between Japan and the US, so the reconciliation between Japan and South Korea, it's so slow, or even like we didn't see the progress. Well, the situation is deteriorating. So now, that's why I shifted my interest about history problem to East Asia, especially Japan, South Korea. And also, so Japan has so many gender problems. So actually we do not have so much progressive gender view. So I think that this is one reason that our view on comfort women is not well developed. So this intersection, history, gender, nationalism, it's very interesting and very important. That's why I have worked on comfort women issue for several years. Okay.
Thank you very much, Seiko, for highlighting the problems we are going to discuss. Seiko is very modest. She is a very respected young political scientist in Japan, is very much in demand in various forum discussions in Japan and internationally. So we have a very good spread of the discipline. So I will turn to the field of education and ask Professor Jun-Sung Kim to say something about your work and how it relates to World War II and education in particular.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jung-Sung Kim from Hiroshima University. Actually, I'm Korean, but I'm working on a Japanese university. And then also education is sometimes conservative, especially my field. I teach social studies education, which is a subject, a combination of geography, history, and civics. So it can be very conservative because it can be recognized as the subject who teach the national citizens, the Japanese or Korean. So for me to take this position is kind of symbolistic, kind of innovative challenge for our university, I guess. So I was an elementary school teacher in South Korea. And at the time, I taught a history part to 6th graders. And then almost the last part of the history is of course the colonization by Japanese empire. And after students learned the lessons from me, and they got pissed off against Japan. And then, but the aim of history education is not being pissed off at Japan. Rather, the aim says the social studies education aims to educate global citizens who can contribute to global peace and international peaceful relationship. So I thought that this is kind of weird. So I taught the contents as the curriculum says, and then the result is almost the opposite as against the curriculum. So I was curious why this kind of things happen and how I can solve this kind of problem. So since I started to work on my PhD thesis, and I started to think about that issue, how I can bridge the two countries. First of all, I analyzed how the same historical event are described in a very different way. For example, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Sino-Japanese War and of course Russo-Japanese War, right? So that two wars happened in Korean Peninsula, even though there is no name in Korea of the war's name. And those two wars are described as history of victim in South Korean textbook. On the other hand, in Japanese history textbook, those two words are described as history of victory because they won against the China who ruled East Asian area for a long time. And then they fought kind of well against Russia, which was one of the big Western empire at the time. And so the two words are described as the process that Japan to be a modern country. So even though the same historical events can be interpreted very differently, however, the students in each country have no idea about that. So I created an opportunity that students can communicate each other. The project that I created is the Let's Make a Better Social Studies textbook. So first of all, I showed the two countries textbook to some country students. For example, I started mainly the Japanese students first, and then I showed the Korean version of textbook of the Sino-Japanese War and Russo-Japanese War. And then they compared it, and then they have their own messages they want to deliver with that historical event. So they created their own version of the Sino-Japanese War and Russo-Japanese War and sent to Korean students. I translated it, and then I showed to Korean students. And then Japanese students sent this kind of version of textbook to you. Then what do you think about that? And then they have a lot of things to say. So they create their version of textbook, and then I translated it, and then I brought back to the Japanese students. And then I asked them, what do you think? And then they have also a lot of things to say. So, okay, let's revise it. And then they revised it, and then I brought back to Korean students. And this kind of way, I created a opportunity, or I might say the public sphere, that the students in two countries can communicate each other through me. So that is my kind of research interest, and then that is kind of one of the examples that what I'm doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for sharing with us the perspective of a practitioner at the forefront of the conflicting memories, and also your suggestion of creating this kind of dialogue among students through you. This is something we will take up later in our discussion. So now we will turn to our third panelist, Paul, who is located in Europe, but as the recent controversy over the Korean comfort woman statue in Berlin shows us that even Europe is affected by the conflicting memories in East Asia. Paul is a political scientist, I believe, who has observed East Asia very closely for a very long time, has written his dissertation on issues related to conflict within East Asia. So could you tell us, please, Paul, how you came to be interested in history, memories, and World War II in particular?
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Yang. And thanks to the organizers. Thank you to the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum for inviting me to take part. As mentioned, so I'm based in Sweden at Lund University, but I have a joint PhD from the UK and Japan, and I'm actually talking to you from Copenhagen, where I live, because Copenhagen and Lund are very close, just across the bridge. I've written articles, indeed, and books on domestic politics and society, and yes, territorial disputes, military bases, trade, and so on. And the thing is, you know, World War II and its memory is unavoidable in researching international relations and politics in the region. It's really interesting if we think of the difference between Europe and East Asia. So, I mean, in Europe, war memory and remembrance is, of course, really important to national identities and nationalism, but it doesn't affect day-to-day relations between the states in the same way. So, you know, in 2015, when Germany and Russia were on very bad terms over the war in Ukraine, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, she still traveled to Moscow to attend the ceremony commemorating the end of World War II, even though the two states had very poor relations at the time. And one German newspaper, the Handelsblatt, the financial newspaper, actually said, and I quote, "Perhaps the past unites the two countries more than the present." Perhaps the past unites the two countries more than the present. That is unimaginable in East Asia. It is exactly the opposite. And as somebody who lives in Europe and feels European but is not an expert on Europe, it was really striking to read that actually at the time. So in East Asia, different understandings of the past really do influence the present and influence day-to-day politics in all countries. And we're talking about World War II and the anniversary and so, but talking about what Professor Kim was saying there, I think we should also consider, I know it's a short time, but consider broadening it out a little bit, because the memory question really does cover Japan's imperial expansion beginning in the 19th century. So Professor Kim mentioned that there was Sino-Japanese War. The first one was in 1895 when Japan takes control of Taiwan. Japan defeats Russia in a battle over influence in Korea in 1905. And so Taiwan and Korea are under Japanese rule this whole period until 1945. So yeah, in a sense, it's a longer story. And in the Korean case, the story is not even the war, because Korea wasn't actually at war with Japan. It was part of the empire. So in a sense, it was actually at war with the Allies. And it's remembered as a colonial era with cultural repression, forced labor. And there are issues directly related to the wars. Professor Seiko mentioned the comfort women issue and so. And the impact of this colonial era influences not just high politics, but like consumer decisions. So perhaps some of the audience will know that there's been a trade war between South Korea and Japan. There's been a boycott of Japanese goods. So the last time I was in Seoul, Asahi Superdry was in every single convenience store fridge. You won't find a can of Asahi Superdry in Korea at the moment. Korean tourists canceled their trips. All the shops had signs outside saying there's no Japanese products here. You know, don't worry. And the trade war is about history. It's a very long, complicated story, but it begins with a Supreme Court ruling on forced labor. One could say it begins with forced labor during the colonial era, but certainly it begins with a Supreme Court ruling on forced labor. And it escalates from there to trade war on high-tech exports and really spreads. But history, it's the history that's at the root. And so between Japan and South Korea, there's so many issues related to war memory. We've heard already some of the others, but Japan has issues with all of its neighbors, also territorial disputes with, as I'm sure our Russian audience knows, the Kuril Islands, known in Japan as the Northern Territories, but also with Korea over Dokdo Takeshima, with China over, China and Taiwan over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Yeah, so it's a very, very complicated issue. I don't want to take too much time for the beginning introduction. There's so much to say. But I would just say that although I'm not a historian, studying the international relations of the region, the history is fundamental and it really influences everything. So even beer choices.
Well, thank you, Paul, for showing us the sharp contrast between how memory affects everyday politics, life in Asia versus Europe. And we will definitely come back to some of these questions and offer explanations. So let me turn to the question, what was your country of origin involved in World War II? As Paul just mentioned, in Korea's case, it's quite complicated. So Jun-sung, could you please help us understand your country of origin, Korea's position in World War II, and also tell us how this war has been remembered in Korea, and has there been any major changes or shifts in the past 75 years?
Okay, actually, Paul made a really good point. Actually, in South Korean history textbook, World War II is not that represented that much. Actually, the colonization is the focus of that period. So many South Korean students maybe have no idea they were in the middle of the World War II. Rather, they learn how Japanese Empire exploited Korean people, and then how they implemented the policy that obliterated the Korean nation. And also, on the other hand, how Korean bravely fought against the Japanese imperial government. So that is the main kind of self-recognized history in South Korea. And then, as you can imagine, Korea is described as a victim of the colonialism and imperialism at the same time. And also that kind of narrative is continued to the another discourse that the South Korea should be, the Japan should apologize to South Korea. And then more, if I further the discussion, that also some Koreans think that Japan need to learn from Germany, like how they apologize. That is a kind of the main narrative about World War II in South Korea. And also the discourse, yes, it has been changed, especially the ending of the Cold War was kind of the big turning point, I would say. So before that, Korea has a Korean War in 1950s. And after that, the tension between South Korea and North Korea was kind of high. So kind of making South Korean citizen is more important issue than competing with other countries. However, after the Cold War, so there are a lot of narratives came into especially the history discussions. So especially at the time, the comfort woman issue, also Seiko mentioned, that kind of the hidden or forgotten history came into the public history sphere. So that kind of change transited the history discussion in South Korea, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you mentioned that Korea, you mentioned South Korea and North Korea. In fact, this very division of the Korean Peninsula into two parts came as a result of World War II, because even though Korea was a Japanese colony, there were many Koreans who resisted Japanese colonization, and they were in China, and the founder of North Korea was in the Soviet Union. So when the war approached its end, they returned to the Korean Peninsula, and with the support of the Soviet Union, is eventually established what is today North Korea. So, but you highlighted the changes in the South Korean remembrance of the war around the 1990, when the Cold War ended. And you mentioned the comfort woman issue. Now, some of the audience may not be quite familiar. And of course, the word comfort woman is a euphemism for tens of thousands of women, mostly Korean, but also other Asian nationalities who were forced into military prostitution to serve the Japanese military during the war. And this issue really came forward after the end of the Cold War, also after the democratization in South Korea. So now we turn to Seiko, and maybe you can tell us how Japan was involved in World War II and how the remembrance of the war has shifted, if at all, in the past 75 years.
Yes, so many things to discuss. But for example, so Professor Dachin says, so even which word we choose is also choice. For example, they just call labor or forced labor or comfort women or sex slave. So we are witnessing the war of word, which word. And so now the government, Japanese government, quite intentionally choose more like comfort women or just labor, and they are not forced. So this kind of discourse is becoming and enters the mainstream in about the historical narrative in contemporary Japan. And also, actually, I personally have a little bit different view, but so here I try to explain the general situation, the main discourse of Japan. For example, today, so many Japanese feel so-called apology fatigue. So, and a lot of Japanese think that whenever Japan approach toward the reconciliation with South Korean people always demand higher compensation and reconciliation, and they're always decline. So yes, I think that Germany has so many lessons for us, East Asian, especially of course Japan, about how we apologize and how we compensate. But now, so people say, so in order to reconcile, so victims' generosity, victims' acceptance is also important. So if Japan should become Germany, so maybe South Korea should become like the victim country like France, and so to accept so reconciliation approach effort of Japan. So now, so I do not personally, I do not agree apology fatigue, but so this is a kind of atmosphere in Japan. And also, so when we look at modern history of Japan, so it's very complicated. But for example, a lot of people, especially people who justified Flavor Japan's conduct, they say at that time, so imperialism, so they are legal. And not only in Japan, but the other Western country did the same thing. But so they say why only Japan is singled out and accused. So I think that when we discuss this legality, but we have to think about some morality. So even it was legal, so we should about some morality. So I think that of course, so colonization is purely immoral, but at the same time, so at that time, so in international law, did not forbid. So it's complicated. So sometimes we have to differentiate legality and morality. And also, so I think that so if we look at the gap between Japanese and Korean people, so a lot of Japanese people feel that so South Korean people's historical view is a little bit simplified, so black and white. So like people who are just and people who are unjust. And so, for example, it's a very difficult to have a conversation about collaborator of South Korea. It's very sensitive and controversial issue. But so Japanese people, including some Japanese historians, think that we need more nuanced understanding of history. There's no like black, white, or totally just or totally unjust. There's always some between, like collaborator. So yes, so this is one reason of our difference. And so the reason of our gap. So yes, and there are several things to discuss. But so yes, so for now, so this is my comments for that, for your question.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned this phrase, apology fatigue. It is a very important recent phenomenon. 5 years ago, at the 70th anniversary of the ending World War II, then Prime Minister Abe made a statement, and he expressed the sentiment that the vast majority of the Japanese people today are born after the end of the war. I think the latest figure is something like 83%, 84%. So why should they keep apologizing for the war and colonization that they had no direct connection? Now, so can I ask you, Seiko, a follow-up question? Can you tell us when the apology actually started? Was it from day one after World War II, or was the apology, let's say, a more kind of incremental development after the end of the war?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And also a little bit here. So we maybe, for example, the official, when we look at official apology, so the first, like more, the most comprehensive apology, maybe we should mention Prime Minister Tomiichi Murayama apology in 1995. But so of course, even before, so historians, so the majority or almost all of them are very progressive, and they are always criticize pre-war Japan and colonization and invasion. So, and I think the round was a highlight of the reconciliation. So this kind of an atmosphere from civil society, so accumulated finally in Tomiichi Murayama's statement of comprehensive apology and remorse for East Asian people, of course, including Korea. And so he clearly apologized and showed remorse. So, but after, and also I have to mention Kono's statement in 1993, in which the government official, Kono, apologized about so-called comfort women. And it was a responsibility of Japanese military and also Japanese government. So this is quite official apology for Korea and East Asian former comfort women. But I think that in this sense, in 1990s, so apology, including official apology, was a peak. And after that, especially in this century, so 21st century, in the beginning of 21st century, we have witnessed the backlash of Kono's statement and Murayama's statement. And actually, so our textbook is still safe. So historical revisionism is in textbook. I do not see this so much influence, but in society. So I think when we discuss history problem, of course, textbook is very important. But at the same time, so now we have so many media, so YouTube and the other kind of books and the TV. So this kind of the other media is becoming quite right wing, and even today we have so many right wing like programs. So yes, so is it the answer? I'm not so sure if.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting this internal dynamic within Japan, and also give us some background as to the official apology in Japan. So Paul, can I ask you to perhaps share your view as a third-party observer and how the memories of war in East Asia may have shifted. Or what are the highlights from your perspective?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it's a bit tricky because obviously my main focus of research is Japan, and I do study the region, but I don't, as they say, I don't have a dog in the race. So I'm not from one country. I don't have the experience also of growing up and going through the education system. But I suppose what I can add is in terms of the changes over time and maybe helping our audience understand a little bit of the differences. So Japan had a very different post-war experience than say Germany, for example. So in Japan, there was a great plan that had been drawn up in Washington, D.C., that Japan would be neutralized, pacified. It would be taken out of the issue of geopolitics for years, essentially. There would be the war criminals, the leaders would be put in jail, and they would be tried. There would be purges. It would be what we saw actually in Germany. That was the plan. But there's something called the reverse course, which happens in the late 1940s when Japan is still occupied by the United States, and the United States is still shaping and molding post-war Japan. And this is because we see, for instance, the Berlin blockade in Europe. We see the victory of the communists against the nationalists in China. We see the invasion by the North of the South in Korea. So there's this sense that the Cold War is really, remember, United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side, right? I don't need to tell this audience that. So there's this sudden descent of the Cold War, and there's this realization in the United States that we need a strong Japan, right? We need a very strong capitalist bulwark against communism. So they reverse a lot of the policies, right? So instead of having this neutralized purged Japan, the conservatives, the people who've been working in the pre-war regime, many are released from prison. They end up, a famous example is the Prime Minister of Japan, Kishi Nobusuke, he was under suspicion of Class A war crimes, but he's rehabilitated. And as I say, I'm not a historian, so I can't go in depth into details, but what we need to know then is that you see a very different treatment of Japan. And this is how we can understand that Japan has a very different way of looking at itself than Germany did also. And Korea too, I mean, the understanding of, as was mentioned, the fact that you have this war which comes out of World War II, the Korean War, and then you have the period of authoritarian rule. And a lot of things are suppressed during this period, right? So much memory of the war is suppressed, and much memory of collaboration is suppressed. So in the 1990s, when democracy comes, it's not that, and maybe we can come to this topic at the end, that democracy does not necessarily mean reduced nationalism, and that a democratic China, for instance, wouldn't suddenly be able to get over the harms that Japan did to it. In fact, democracy offers the opportunity for enterprising politicians to play with nationalism and to use nationalism as a vote getter. So these are the kind of things that we need to be aware of. And finally, I would say very briefly on China, that also how China remembers, or how the Communist Party remembers the war has changed. So in the early days, the Communist Party was the victorious, right? The Communist Party had defeated the nationalists and had defeated the Japanese, but especially had defeated the nationalists who had fled to Taiwan in the Civil War. And this was the main thing to remember. And gradually, over time, that changed, particularly after the Tiananmen Square incident, but already in the 1980s, there was a shift towards patriotic education. And some of the historians can correct me here, but my understanding is that as Maoism and communism was no longer being so clearly implemented following the opening up by Deng Xiaoping, and there was a sort of state capitalism coming in, the CCP needed new sources of legitimacy. And one source of legitimacy was this what Japan had done, this victimhood that China had, and that the Communist Party could play into, and also play up its role in fighting the Japanese. So it switched from being about the Civil War to being about the war with Japan. And this is related to, as I say, the changing ideology of the Communist Party coming into the 1990s. So each country also has its own internal dynamics in terms of how these war memories have shifted. I would say that.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for giving us several very important issues to consider: the Cold War, the democratization, and the rise of nationalism. Speak of China, this is my country of origin, and when I was a student, in schools there, I definitely experienced the shift in the remembrance of World War II that Paul just described, from this war that emphasized the Communist Party's role to a slight shift to, let's say, emphasizing this as an all Chinese nations war against Japan, in which the nationalists, which was communist enemy in the Civil War, but during World War II, they also played a role, and they are acknowledged today. And also from the international perspective, after China opened up, China emphasized it is part of a worldwide anti-fascist war. So in 2015, the 70th anniversary, the Chinese government organized a huge victory parade. They tried to invite all the world's leaders, but eventually the most important leaders were President Vladimir Putin of Russia and the then President Park Geun-hye from South Korea. So there is that international dimension that is also being emphasized in China, very different from when I was small. But this serves as a perfect transition to our next questions. By the way, I already see questioning from our audience coming in, and I will try to work them into my question for the panelists. So what are the influences on the memories of war, some of which of course have been already mentioned, but perhaps we can get a little bit closer within each country, not just the international environment, but especially the role of education and how they shape the next generation, the young generation, the post-war generation's view of a war that they did not experience firsthand. We had a question from Eric from Rwanda and also from Vienna about the influence of global memory culture. I think especially after the end of the Cold War, the influence of such a global memory culture has become very obvious. Or other global movements, global values. Of course, you know, with the comfort woman issue, the global feminist movement of defending women's rights played, of course, a role. But you're the expert, so who would like to take up this?
I would like to cede my time because I'd like to hear more from the two experts, so I will take a pass on.
So yes, so rural education. So perhaps Jung-sung, you can continue what you had started earlier. In your view, do you think the school education was the most decisive influence, would you say, on the population's memory of World War II or history in general?
Yeah, actually, before I answer to your question, I need to explain the context of Korea and Japan. So in South Korea and also Japan, the textbook is really strong narrative that is almost written by government. For example, even though even two countries adopt the textbook authorization system, so that means the government do not write the textbook itself. However, they authorize the textbook the textbook only meets the government's standards. So that means the government can control the narrative. So that is the one thing that you need to know. And the other thing is the culture of the education itself. So going to the university and getting a higher score is really important in both countries. So many history classrooms, many history teachers tend to emphasize to get a good score at the kind of standardized test, the kind of nationalized standardized test. So to prepare that, many students tend to memorize the specific historical events and then to observe the specific discourses that is written in textbook. That means authorized narrative by each government. So understanding that context, now you can understand how education, maybe intently or unintently, reproduce the narrative that is authorized by government. So I would say that the teachers really need to do meta recognition of that kind of tendency. So textbook is also written by someone. So it is so they need to understand the importance to give students to analyze that kind of aspect of the construction of history. Yeah, and then also I may explain a little bit later, but I will explain how students can be open to others' discourses. Yeah.
Johnson, while we are with Korea, can I ask a follow-up question? Namely, when you were a teacher, besides school education, besides textbook, what were other factors influencing the young generation's view of history? For example, museums or popular culture? If you have any thoughts on this, I think our audience would love to hear.
Yeah, definitely. So students already know something about history, and then they bring that kind of knowledge into the classroom, as you said. In my generation, the history manga, the animation, that kind of thing was a really powerful thing that students love to watch, and the television at the time. But now, as Seiko mentioned, the social network service and those kind of medias, then students keep watching that, and then it also recommends the similar content. So they keep watching this kind of echo chamber, so that kind of system can affect the students' knowledge about the history. And also the family is also important, I would say that. And then the kind of family narrative also runs down to students. So we need to care about that kind of aspect too.
Yeah, the last point you mentioned is also very important. The family, this less public memory also shaped the younger generation. Now, Seiko, I know you're not an expert on education like Jun-sung, but you grew up in the Japanese education system, and you finished the Tokyo University, which is very difficult to get into. So you must have studied very hard. But more seriously, what was your experience from your personal experience, but also as a scholar of social science and analysis of memory? What is in Japan's?
Yes, so actually entrance exam is one thing. So because I think, so now, so Japanese textbook system is functioning. Of course, they need governmental authorization, but I do not see governmental control. So I think the scholar have their freedom, and there's some standard that have to be met. But I think the scholars' views are quite appreciated in current textbook system. So, but that's, I think that, so in this sense, I do not say Japanese textbook is revisionist or right-wing, becoming right-wing, but they are, I think, too neutral. So just have detailed explanation, even about this very controversial issue, comfort women issue, Nanjing massacre. So they are just there's some number and explanation, very not interesting explanation. So when we compare the Japanese textbook with the other textbook, especially European textbook, I think that one of the biggest difference is to whether it promotes critical thinking. So of course, every Japanese textbook have Nagasaki and Hiroshima atomic bombing, but there's no critical why. So these two cities have had to have atomic bombing. And so of course, in order to understand that, we have to understand the Japanese invasion before atomic bombing. And so this kind of critical thinking, there was some other way than imperialism for modern Japan. This kind of critical thinking, there should have been some alternative way. This kind of questions and critical thinking is quite missing in Japanese history textbook. So in this sense, it should be improved. And I think that this related to, with the also very not interesting entrance exam. So we need some knowledge, but we do not need critical thinking to pass the entrance exam. So maybe we have to change entrance exam system also. And yes, and also, so there about the question of global memory culture, it's very interesting. And in this context, I think the comfort women's structure is interesting. It's now, so of course, in South Korea, in many cities, and in US. And I heard that in Berlin and so one small city in Germany also have comfort women's structure. So it is spreading literally all over the world. So, and why it is spreading, I think that so sexual violence, I think the rape is becoming a serious issue only in 1990s after we witnessed large sexual violence in Yugoslavia. So, and after that, so we pay attention to comfort women and victim of sexual violence. So in this sense, comfort women issue is relatively new issue. So that's why we have so many things, but I hope that we can have more nice conversation situating this issue in the more global context, universal context, because just between Japan and South Korean government, maybe we cannot have the good conversation. But if we broaden the context, I hope we have some different conversation on this issue.
Yes, on this.
I add some comment. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, please.
Can I add some comments to what Seiko said?
Absolutely.
Okay, so about the textbook. So yeah, as Seiko said, the Japanese government does not kind of put the revisionist think to students. However, they have the specific standard. For example, for when they authorize the Japanese elementary school textbook, every textbook need to have this specific 80. Well, sorry, I'm not sure about the exact number. They need to deal with this 38 or something figures, otherwise they will not get authorized. So that kind of selection is also one of the way to control the narrative. That's what I mentioned. And also about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that is really good point. So in Japanese history textbook, Hiroshima and Nagasaki just came out, kind of disconnected to the past. So there is a past and something blank, and Nagasaki, Hiroshima, boom. So it is really hard to connect Hiroshima, what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the what happened in the before kind of 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And compared to that, these days I research in Austria actually, and then they teach history and civics at the same time. That is the one singular subject. So when they learn history, they learn civics too. So past and present is very close. So it's compared to Austria, the Japanese history education is just history education and the kind of memorizing the facts. And then as Seiko said, kind of lacking of educating the critical thinking. So that is the kind of the thing that I need to do in this country. And also about the global memory culture, that is the connection. The connection of memory is really interesting. And then I read one article that mentioned about the statue that was established in Glendale, and then in the United States, and the city that there are many I forgot the country's name. Sorry. What happened? Genocide happened by Turkish.
Armenia.
Armenia. Sorry. Yeah. So 40% of the residents were Armenian in the city. So that kind of memory and connected to another memory, kind of difficult past. So that is the another way of implication and then connection, I would say.
Yeah, this last point is very interesting. And some people say that now after the end of the Cold War, we really live in the age of memory. And also this memory put a lot of emphasis on the memory of victimhood, in contrast to the earlier decades where heroes in war tend to be emphasized more than victims. Some observers point out that the Holocaust was one of the major factors that shifted the global memory toward the memory of victims. And so to me, it's not a coincidence that since the 1990s in East Asian countries, we pay a lot of attention to victims. In my hometown, Nanjing, in 1985, for the first time, the Chinese government built a museum to the victims of the Nanjing massacre, and it has only become bigger, and it has agreements with other similar museums in Poland, in Israel. So there is this kind of a global memory culture, just one of the many examples. So now we started with Seiko's brief comment about some of the key issues that is affecting relations between Korea and Japan that can be directly linked to World War II. And I think that's a point Paul also observed. So give us maybe a bit more on these conflicts and tensions of memory of World War II, not only between countries, but also within countries. I think Seiko had alluded to the fact that many Japanese historians were progressive, and they talk about Japan's invasion and colonization, and yet the government, at least the conservative government, tended to emphasize something else. And there was also a question from the audience from Ator that asks whether in Japan, it's partly because some of the wartime symbols like the emperor and Nihonjinron and rising sun flag were not banned or eradicated, unlike Germany. But of course, these are symbols that are also contested very much within Japan. So both within Japan and between Japan and its neighbors, what are some of the tensions and conflicts for all of our three panelists? Any?
I suppose I can just take a couple of straightforward examples, maybe that might illustrate it at the popular level as well as at the international level of international relations and politics. So we heard about the fact that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the use of nuclear weapons, is remembered kind of ahistorically, right, as this tragedy that befalls both cities, but it's not clearly explained how and why this came about, right? But it's very strong. The memory is very strong in Japan, and it ties into this broader victim narrative that the people of Japan were in some ways victims of the war, right? Because they were misled by this military clique, which takes over the top levers of government and drags Japan into this unwinnable war. And the result is that the Japanese people suffer, and suffer they do. I mean, that's unquestionable. And that Japan is the only country then that suffers the horror of nuclear weapons, and remains, thankfully, to this day, right? And this is really a big important part of the victim story. But if you go across to Korea, a couple of years ago, there was a big controversy again between Japan and Korea when the world's greatest, most famous, most popular boy band, BTS, who most people maybe over 40 will never have heard of, but everybody under 30 at least will know very well, because they are the most popular band in the world. So there was a case where Jimin, one of the members, a photograph surfaced of him wearing a t-shirt which had an image of Japan being bombed by a nuclear weapon. And the line was, patriotism, our history, liberation, Korea. And there was a big controversy in Japan, obviously, because it seemed that it was glorifying the nuclear bombing. And this was BTS, a non-political, the most apolitical band. They go to the UN, and I think they have some special status as UN ambassadors or so. So the idea that they would be glorifying the destruction of two cities with nuclear weapons was shocking. So, you know, you have, and that's because the nuclear weapons, as the explanation was, it means something very different. It's about the anniversary of this is the day that Japan was getting ready to lose the war, that Korea was going to get its freedom, the nuclear weapons led to Korean freedom, so patriotism, our history, liberation, Korea. So this event, even this event, can have two very, very different understandings in two countries right beside each other. And then and a similar event, just to show the difference in understanding among the people, is, so there's this dispute, Dokdo or Takeshima. Dokdo is the Korean name, Takeshima is the Japanese name. It's controlled by Korea. As the dispute has been going on for a long time. But 2005, the local government near the Japanese local government, prefectural government in Shimane, announced that they would make a Takeshima Day. And most people in Japan had never heard of Takeshima. It's the least known of the disputes. Really, people were not interested in the dispute, actually. And the reason they were announcing this Takeshima Day was going to celebrate the incorporation of this rock into Japan 100 years ago, back in 1905. So it was to commemorate the day that the rock was incorporated into, or the island was incorporated into Japan and into that prefecture, because that's the Japanese claim, that it was incorporated 100 years ago. And these local politicians made this decision, and really it was aimed at Tokyo. They were annoyed, they wanted resources, they wanted attention, they wanted Japan to step in and do something about fishing rights in the Sea of Japan, or the East Sea, the sea that is shared by Korea and Japan. So it was really aimed at Tokyo. It was not for external consumption at all. But it got out into the Korean media, and there was huge consequences. There was large anti-Japanese protests, many agreements and top-level bilateral agreements were cancelled, and meetings were cancelled, but also lower-level sister city arrangements were cancelled. And the people who organized that event, they had no idea. They had no idea of the level of the sentiment. They had no idea of the implications of what they were doing. So I give these two examples just to show how two events that might seem fairly straightforward actually can have completely different implications in the two different countries. So yeah, I think that's my contribution I'd like to make.
Thank you very much for giving us such vivid illustrations. What about you, Seiko and Jung-Sung? Yes, please.
Yeah, actually, I can further the discussion of Hiroshima. So in South Korean textbook, the Hiroshima has one, it's with the description of the one sentence: because of the atomic bomb, Korea got independent. However, in Japan, there are a lot of descriptions about the damages and then what happened after the bombing. And then also, interestingly, in American textbook, the dropping nuclear bombs is dealt as a controversial issues. So Truman did a good job or a bad job. So in each country's context, the same historical event is described very differently. Also, one more interesting historical event related to Hiroshima is the former President Obama's Hiroshima visit in 2016. So at the time, even inside of the Hiroshima, there are two opinions. Some people are really happy that he visited in Hiroshima. That is enough for us. However, some people, especially one former mayor, got really angry, and he mentioned that former President Obama should not use Hiroshima as his final ending theater. And that was almost the end of his period, and then he visited Hiroshima, so that's why he used that term. On the other hand, the South Korean media and then Japanese media keeps mentioning that Japan should not pretend to be as a victim. So that kind of the different narratives are very complexly intersected in his visit. and also the Tokto Takeshima issue, and then the related No Japan movement in South Korea. And actually, I was in the middle of the No Japan movement this time. This time, No Japan movement was initiated by the Supreme Court's decision about the forced labor. So Japanese opinion, the Japanese government official opinion is that all the compensation is over by one treaty that South Korea and Japan agreed in 1960s, and we don't have Japan doesn't have to compensate more. And the Supreme Court's decision was that one Japanese company still need to compensate for the forced labors. So that kind of tension caused the No Japan movement, and also kind of stop issuing visa for each countries, and even the kind of military agreement. So the Japan and South Korea share military information against mainly North Korea, and the South Korean government said that maybe we will not renew the agreements because of that kind of issue. So as Paul said, the tension between South Korea and Japan surrounding the historical issues is still going on, and every year in our life.
Jun-so, I'm surprised when you say that there's only one line in Korean textbook about Hiroshima. So I assume, what about Korean victims of the atomic bomb? Was it mentioned?
Actually, that's really good question. Actually, 1/10 of the victims who died in Hiroshima 1945 was Korean who came to Japan at the time. But interestingly, they don't say anything about them. The South Korean history textbook doesn't say anything about them. And then recently, there in some very rural area, the one museum just got established for memorizing them. However, that kind of narrative is not hidden, I maybe forgotten. And then, yeah, actually, I'm kind of trying to deal with that kind of issue with other scholars in Japan.
Yeah, do you have any speculation why this is the case? Because there were quite a large number of Korean population that were directly affected by the atomic bombing. Why is it silenced in Korea itself? Why do you think is the reason?
It is just my opinion, so there is no kind of actual evidence, but I would say that that kind of interpretation or facts does not fit the grand narrative that Korean government created. So the Korean government, or at least the Korean people, society, decided some specific grand narrative, especially kind of nationalistic, and then creates Koreanism among the society. So that kind of peripheral historical event can be ignored. That especially if that cases does not support the grand narrative.
Thank you. So Seiko, could you please then offer your observation and add to your earlier remarks? And also there is a question from the audience that whether the war memory in Japan is so different, I assume, from Germany, I think, in this question, because of those what he called wartime symbols or pre-war symbols, I think probably is more accurate, were still allowed to continue.
Yeah, very good and difficult question. But so, for example, about the emperor, so since that there was a Cold War, so at that time, as Paul mentioned, so U.S. needed stronger Japan, and so emperor was kind of used as a symbol to unify Japanese people. And so that's why the United States also allow Japanese to maintain emperor. So it is complicated. And of course, among Japanese, we have a quite diverse. Now the current emperor and his family are very popular, and we are now forgetting the law once the emperor did in pre-war Japan. But there, of course, among scholars, so there are always critical opinion on the emperor and the emperor law in pre-war era. And also, so about the rising sun flag, it is about the cause of friction between Japan and Korea. And actually, personally, I don't like. But so still, the self-defense force is using, and I think why some people stick to using the rising sun flag, I think actually, of course, as a historian, I do not agree with the view, but a lot of Japanese people differentiate Meiji and Taisho era and Showa era. And of course, Japan did wrong. Japan took wrong path in Showa era. But before that, Japan was successful. And at that time, Japan was the only colored nation in the world recognized by Western power. So some people still stick to this like glorified history period. So I think this definitely relate. Now the Japanese, of course, about the as economic power, military power, China surpassed Japan. And if we look at pop culture, so South Korean pop culture is literally globalizing. For example, BTS, actually I like BTS as well, but they also have the influence in the United States. And they already contribute to Black Lives Movement. So it shows us how they are universalized. So we are losing in pop culture. I think the Japanese pop culture is not so popular like Korean pop culture in the world. So we are losing confidence. That's why some people want to see the source of glorification in the history. So maybe we have to look at the contemporary shifting power relation. And also, so Professor Yang's student, she poses excellent question. Yeah, so young generation, actually my student all like Korean pop culture, and every year before COVID-19 prevented, every year I took my student to Korea and I visited Comfort Women Museum in Seoul, and they simply just feel sympathy with what happened to comfort women. And from sociological view, so elderly are definitely around the majority, they are majority of the anti-Korean group. They are elderly people. So yes, I think education, the young people, and they are like simply like Korean society, pop culture. So as a historian, the educator, I want them to know the history, but yes, I think I have the hope for the younger generation if we properly educate them about history.
This is a perfect segue to our last question. That is, what do you think are the ways to overcome the conflicting memories in East Asia? What is the prospect for reconciliation? And what are some of the obstacles, and what are the achievements? So maybe we have enough time for this last question. Perhaps any other question from the audience? This is also your last opportunity. Jun-sung, besides education, do you see other opportunities for dialogue, or maybe even you can tell us what have been some of the past efforts?
So, yeah, so there are a lot of grassroots interactions as what the Professor Seiko has done is kind of, I would say, the grassroots interactions, and that kind of I would say communication, kind of private communication and grassroots communication is really important. However, I would say that I would argue that the participants of the communication should understand the impossibility of the ultimate mutual understanding. But I rather would argue that accepting that we cannot agree 100%, we cannot reach 100% argument, accepting that fact, even though we cannot agree 100%, we need to keep talking. So that kind of attitude, I would say that is true mutual understanding. So in my field, I have done the projects that I explained, the textbook project, and also I involved a project to redesign the last 10 feet of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. So each museum has the last stages that they really want to say. The message was condensed. So students from many other countries, America and Indonesia, New Zealand, and also Japan, and came together, and then they exchanged their own description of Hiroshima in their own context, and then they created their own version of the last 10 feet of Hiroshima Museum. And this is just one example. So this kind of the opportunity to interact each other's perspectives and then try to keep communicating is the hope that the Professor Seiko mentioned. And then that is the way that I would love to create. I love to bridge the perspectives of between South Korea and Japan and other countries too.
Thank you, Junsun. Paul, in addition to these grassroots efforts, perhaps you can help us understand what are the potentials and limitations on the government level political dialogue over the war memories and other disputes.
Sure, I mean, there's obviously, thank you, there's domestic political constraints, but then there's also geopolitical constraints. I mean, we should think about, so the Korean War, we're talking today about World War II and maybe the colonial era, but the Korean War itself is coming slowly back in China. In China, it's known as the war to resist America and aid Korea. And memory of this war is becoming more important. And the reason is because it is the war where America and China fought each other directly. And perhaps unsurprisingly, as tensions rise between the United States and China, this war now is rising. And in the United States, it's the forgotten war, right? Literally, it's known as the forgotten war. But it's definitely coming back, I think. And this is a result of geopolitical shifts. So to some extent, also as relations in the post-2016 Trump era, relations between Japan and China quietly started to improve. And historical issues, there is the ability at the top level to put historical issues aside for geopolitical imperatives. Undoubtedly there is. So as geopolitics shifts, I think also we'll see elites' use of history shift. I mean, and they operate within constraints. There's some argument that the Communist Party has got itself in a little bit of a bind because by playing the nationalism so much and building it up so much, it binds its hands in terms of what it can do with relations with Japan and so. But I just wanted to finish. I noted that there was a question there on Okinawa, and I've done quite a bit of research on Okinawa actually. So the question was about whether Okinawa should be considered separately when teaching and researching the Second War, and how the situation of Okinawa is very particular. And I think that was from Gosha, if I don't know exactly how to pronounce the name. But indeed, as they point out, Okinawa only became part of Japan in the 19th century. One thing that we definitely don't know in Europe is the difficult history of Okinawa. So Okinawa was the only part of the so-called the home islands, the main part of Japan, to actually see ground battle. So there was a Battle of Okinawa. 1/3 approximately of the civilians, residents of the island, died as a direct result of that battle. But that was the only place in Japan where there was a battle. So the mainland was actually spared, but Okinawa was forced to suffer this. Okinawa was then kept as under US control until 1972. So when the US occupation left Japan in the early 50s, they stayed in Okinawa until 1972. And to this day, Okinawa has approximately 20 to 25% of the surface area of the island is covered in US bases, actually. So there is a place where the legacy of World War II and the Cold War is very, very much in focus. Though I would say that considering it separately, you know, culturally over time it has become less and less distinct from Japan. It is slowly been assimilated, and young people in Okinawa don't really speak the Okinawan language. Rather, they speak a dialect of Japanese. So, but I think, you know, this is something that for Westerners, and particularly for an American audience, I think it's really important to know what's going on, because it is American bases there that are causing quite a lot of problems. And it's not that the people there are anti-American or they want all the bases to leave. They just want some more influence in how politics are done in Okinawa. So I think that's something that for our American audience might be interested in reading up a little bit about the Okinawan issue.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Okinawa also was the fierce battleground in the final phase of the war. And also Okinawa today has maybe what can be said a new model of remembrance in what is called the cornerstone of peace. It's a memorial park when all victims from all sides are commemorated. And that's could be a hope for the future for East Asia as well. And so we are running, I think, out of time. Perhaps just one quick final word for our audience from each of the panelists. Seiko, would you like to say just one final word?
Yes. So from today's discussion, so it was very interesting. So I think we have to regard reconciliation as a multi-layered task. So especially between Japan and Korea, now governmental efforts are now they are stagnant. So that's why we have to focus on the civil society level and also education, students. So if we look at reconciliation as multi-layered task, maybe we do not have to lose hope totally. And about Okinawa, it is also very interesting and we have to discuss more. But today we mainly talked about the history problems, international history problems. But we have to look at the history problems within the country. So for example, the Okinawa, there was a mass suicide forced by Japanese military, but the Ministry of Education ordered the textbook publisher to delay the passage because further it is not confirmed. So we have some domestic history problems, and maybe we need some further discussion about this. Thank you for questions.
Thank you. Jun-sung?
Yeah, as Professor Seiko mentioned, that education is really important. And what I mean by education is not just for school education, but also the social education for adults and everyone in a society. So we need to create a public sphere that we can discuss about the differences of the different discourses. That is really important. And the only thing that I'm worrying about the globalization of the memory is that, how can I say that, each country tried to be a victim. So being a victim is now a kind of strong side. So they try to be they are very focusing on the numbers, right? Especially how many people died in Nanjing massacres and how many people died in Poland, and then how many ratio of the Jewish at the time and the real Polacks at the time. So that kind of numbers. And then we, as educators and then the researchers, we need to be cautious about that, and then we need to let people know that kind of aspects of the globalization of memory. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, do you have something to add?
I think I've said everything I was ready to say. I think, yeah, I would like to say that it's really inspiring to listen to these experts and to hear. I think it's, you know, really great to hear this work from people who are doing on the ground work between young people from both states. I think that's really, really important.
Yes, thank you very much. I also learned a lot from this discussion. So I want to thank the three panelists for contributing their insight. I also want to thank the audience for being with us for more than an hour and a half and asking excellent questions. Apologize for not being able to get to every single one of them. And my final thanks goes to Christina and the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum for hosting such an important series of discussions on World War II memory. I only hope this conversation will continue. Stay tuned. Thank you again.
I wanted now to thank you, people are leaving now, but it was good and illuminating discussion with you. And I think it was very useful for us also to understand different points of view. And in Eastern Asia, something that I think that people were also interested and also asked many questions. And for me, it was also very interesting to learn about Hiroshima. And one sentence in the Korean textbooks, it's the same, thing that struck me a lot, Professor Yang. And yesterday, I also learned from another presentation on Korean textbooks. It's about that you also don't really teach about World War II, or it's not so much in the textbooks about USSR. So is it right, Hyung-sung, or how? Because this is what I was told yesterday in one presentation. So I was so amazed because it was so central point here in Europe to study about World War II and USSR.
I'm sorry, I just have to say I have to leave because I have another Zoom meeting immediately.
Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining and your voice and brains and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Can I just jump in? And I forgot, I should thank all the people who worked very hard to make this panel discussion and so smooth, and the interpreter, of course. Thank you. And yes, Jun-sun, I think Christina wants to know.
Yes, in South Korean history, the colonization period is about only the Korea and Japan. So other countries is kind of, how can I say, not ignored, but kind of forgotten at the time. So how Korean fought against Japanese imperial, and then how Japanese tried to colonize South Korea at the time was the main discourses of the World War II. So World War II, the word itself is, I may say, that less than 5 times turns up in the description of that time.
Thank you, Young-sung. And yes, and would like to thank also our colleagues at the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum, is our communication team, and also our dear colleagues, friends at the college, Adam and Lorena. Thank you very much for this, support and organization of this discussion. And yes, so I just thought, what to say, bye-bye maybe, but I hope that you will stay in touch. And for Professor Yang, it's the start of the day, and for you, it's the start of them going to rest in Japan, because it is late in the evening, so I will not keep you longer. So thank you very much for your insights. And we keep in touch. We will record this presentation, and it is also on the Facebook, so you can also feel free to share it.
Yes, Christina, may I just offer a very belated suggestion? If anyone in the audience has questions still, they may send it to you at the forum, and then you can direct the questions to anyone.
Okay. Maybe we can write it in the Facebook, and just one general question, and if there's some questions, so we can also direct it to you. Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So thank you, and bye bye. Have a nice evening and day. Bye bye.